The carriages are the movable part of your machine. They do all the work. You can use them together when you're knitting with needles on both beds, or you can use the back carriage by itself when you're knitting on the back bed only. To clip the two carriages together, use the coupling catch. This is the black molded plastic piece on the front carriage that snaps the two carriages together. To release the coupling catch, press forward on the front, then slide the carriage to the side. Again, snap the carriages together or release. Because you have a true double bed knitting machine, the buttons or keys on the front carriage are the same as those on the back. 0 is the cancel key. When the cancel key is pressed, it springs back out and you can pass the carriage across the knitting without affecting it. The cancel key is the only key that does not remain depressed once it has been pressed. The triangular shaped key is the knit key. When this key is pressed, the needles that are in working position will knit every row. The tuck key is the flattened V-shaped key. It is used to create fancy stitches, like the one used to knit this afghan. This is a honeycomb tuck stitch pattern. The circular arrow is for knitting in tubular or circular knitting. When the carriages are passed from right to left, the needles on the front bed knit. When the carriages are passed from left to right, the needles on the back bed will knit. This creates a continuous tube of knitted fabric. You can use the circular keys to knit socks and mittens or even a circular skirt. Again, this is the cancel key, the knit key, the tuck key, and the circular key. The large dial in the center of the carriage is the stitch size dial. You can use stitch sizes from 1 to 12 with half sizes in between, 23 sizes in all. The outside of the dial turns to indicate stitches starting with 1, 1 1/2, 2, 2 1/2, and so on around the dial. Stitch size 1 is for fine yarns, such as 224 or industrial yarns. Stitch size 12 is for heavy yarns, up to but not including 4-ply knitting worsted. The higher the number, the bigger the stitch that is formed, as the diagram on the front of the dial shows. The needle return buttons are to the right and left of the stitch size dial on both carriages. They have two different jobs. When they are pointing down, they bring any needles that you have in position 3 back to working position 1. When they are pointing up, they will cause any selected needles to move from working position 2 to holding position 3. The center position, represented by a dot on your carriage, is neutral. Most of the time, the needle return buttons will remain in the neutral position. The small round buttons at the lower left and right of the front carriage are called the needle selection buttons. They are on the front carriage only. To activate them, push in on the buttons and turn them up to the symbol for every other needle selection. They are used to create some fancy stitch patterns by causing every other needle on the front bed to knit. When you are using the needle selection buttons, you must have an even number of needles in working position on the front bed. When the needle selection buttons are not in use, neutral. The small button underneath the carriage is called the jacquard key. There is one on each carriage. This key is used when knitting with more than one color. Here is a piece of jacquard knitting. Can you see that there are knit stitches on both sides of the fabric? This tells you that it has been made on a double bed machine. You can use your back bed only to create colored fair isle fabric. Fair isle fabric is always knit on a single bed. An easy way to determine this is to check the wrong side of the fabric. If it has floats, like this, it is a single bed fabric. When knitting either type of fabric, you will use the jacquard key. The little levers on the sides of the carriage are called the locking levers. They lock the carriages onto the slide rails. If you jam your carriage in the middle of the row, you can release it by lifting up on the locking levers to move the carriage away from the knitting. Be sure that you lock the carriage back onto the slide rail. This is very important. You can damage your carriage by trying to knit without the carriages locked onto the slide rails. Test by trying to lift the carriage. Be sure that the carriages are locked. On the carriage there is a large black plastic cam shaped like a triangle. This is the row counter cam, and it trips the row counter each time the carriage is passed across the knitting. The row counter lever can be kept in adjustment by pushing up or pressing down to see that your row counter is tripping properly. To set the row counter back to 0, push in on the small knob at the right and turn it towards you. Do not release the pressure on the knob until you have clicked all of the wheels completely back to 0. You must be sure that all of the wheels inside the counter are squarely at 0 or the counter will not trip properly. To do this, press in on the small knob and turn it towards you without releasing the pressure. This is the tension unit. It is designed to carry 2 yarns at the same time. The yarn separator keeps your yarn from tangling and guides them up to each side of the tension unit itself, then down to the carriages. The knobs at the side of the tension unit govern the amount of tension or drag on the yarn. One is a very high tension and is for fine yarns. 11 is a loose tension and is for heavy yarn. If you're using a fine yarn, turn the knob to 1. If you're using a heavy, hairy, or nubby yarn, turn the dial to 11. Most of the time, leave the tension unit set on 4. If you're not sure where to set it, 4 is a good place to start. This is a very unfussy tension unit. The setting shouldn't need to be changed unless there is a problem in the knitting. Now that you're familiar with your machine, you're ready to knit. First, let's thread the machine. Use sport weight yarn in a light color. This will help you to see the stitches easily. Place the cone of yarn on the floor. If you don't have much room, you can place the cone on the table, but ideally it will be on the floor to allow the yarn to unwrap from the cone evenly. The yarn passes through the separator and then between the 2 silver discs on the tension unit. There is a small white plastic bump between the 2 discs. The yarn must pass underneath this bump. Now the yarn comes forward through the first guide, then up over the plastic wheels. It slips in from the side, then through the front of the tension unit. Now it travels down to the carriage. The carriage yarn guide is open so that the yarn can slip easily inside. Draw the yarn underneath the carriage, then down between the needle beds. There is a clip on the clamp of the knitting machine that is designed to hold the yarn. Press the clip over the yarn and it will remain in place. If you find the clip difficult to reach, use a spring clothespin to hold the yarn underneath the machine.